Great. Okay. So thank you everyone for coming to today's lunch seminar. I'm really happy to have Sean Santos, who's a new postdoc who's working with Marcus and recently completed his PhD this past December. Marcus, I'm not sure if you wanted to kind of introduce Sean. Did you want to say a few kind of sentences about some of the work that you're planning on doing?
Yeah, sure. So Sean's going to be working a lot on microphysics and sort of microphysics within the context of climate model tuning. So this is an effort that's also going to involve Greg Alcesser and his tuning effort, as well as some folks at involved with the E3SM model and Hugh Morrison, who's developed this BOSS microphysics scheme. So this work that he's going to show is his PhD work, which I think actually might relate to some of the issues, because I think these time integration errors I'm really interested to hear if they sort of relate to our ability to learn other parts of model physics. Anyways, I've talked enough.
Great, thanks, Marcus. So Sean, whenever you want to start. So just before quickly though, again, if we're going to do the standard thing. If people have questions, just write or indicate them in the chat, and I'll unmute you, and then you can ask, and Sean will respond. So, Sean, take it away.
All right. So yeah, I'm going to talk about specifically. I'm going to focus on precipitation in the E3SM atmosphere model. Although this is part of a broader study that looked at sort of the clouds more generally, and sort of circulation changes in E3SM that occur when you change the model time step. It's work I did with Peter Caldwell at Lawrence Livermore National Lab and Chris Brotherton, who is my advisor at the University of Washington. So I'm going to talk about some results globally, and then I'm going to zoom in on a particular case study in South America to try to understand on a more process-oriented level what some of the causes may be for some of the changes that we see. So when we look at the literature on atmospheric general circulation models, there's a lot of studies that look at horizontal resolution. The time step of the atmospheric dynamics is often constrained by the CFL condition. So whenever you change the horizontal resolution, you end up having to change the time step of the dynamics quite often. But it's less common to look at the rest of the atmospheric physics and how the time step affects that. And especially to do a more controlled study where you look at just changing the time step independently of the horizontal resolution. So this is my little sort of rant before the rest of the talk, just to say that it does make it a little bit more difficult to know which kinds of problems are common to different models when the literature is thin. So right now, actually, the CAM model family, which is like CESM, E3SM, back to CESM, those studies of those models seem to really dominate the literature on time step sensitivity. And so it would be nice to see studies with Model E or with other types of models. So that said, we want to know how much does the time resolution actually matter for EAM-v1. The easiest way to do that is to just change it and find out what happens. We started with 2 short runs, just 3 years. This is not a project that where we had a lot of core hours available. And those were run at the standard resolution for E3SM, which is 1 degree. Sea surface temperatures and sea ice extent are prescribed. We're really just looking at the dynamic. And the control run uses the model default time step, which is a half hour for most of the physics and the dynamic physics coupling. And then we have a modified run, which I'm going to refer to as all-10, that uses a time step of 10 seconds for basically everything in the atmosphere model. The one exception being the radiative transfer is just historically not tied to the model time step. It's recalculated every hour. That doesn't turn out to matter that much, but when we've tried changing it, but for this particular one, we left that alone. So I'm just going to show right off the bat how precipitation patterns change between these two runs. And on the left, I have the large-scale precipitation. So this is coming from the stratiform schemes. And then I have the total on the left, which is basically this plus the precipitation coming from the deep convection scheme. And these are differences between the all-10 and the control run. So the red is where the all-10 produces more precipitation, blue is less. And so you can see that in the all-10 run, large-scale precipitation increases basically everywhere. The increase is strongest over land in the tropics. You can see this very clearly is lining up with some of the mountains there. It's also increasing where you would already have relatively heavy rainfall. And that's up to a 50% increase. So this is a big change regionally. The convective precipitation decreases on average, which largely cancels out the global mean, not entirely, but basically we see a big shift away from the convective scheme. And that actually dominates what's going on in the ocean. So in the few places where convective precipitation increases, you see an increase in overall precipitation. Everywhere else, there's a decrease. We also see that when we change the time step, we have much more extreme values for our precipitation. So this graph is just showing precipitation density. And this, the vertical we have about how much, if you pick a random on the globe, how much precipitation on average is coming for from events with that level of hourly precipitation. So much more of the precipitation is now coming from cases where the hourly precipitation rate is over 100 millimeters a day. Another way to think about what's going on is in terms of the water budget. If you look at the global mean residence time of water in the atmosphere, just total water over total precipitation. For the control run, it's a little bit on the low side, actually, for GCM. It's a little over 7 days. The all-10 run, that goes down to 6.9 days. So the message that I get from this is that enhanced precipitation is drying out the atmosphere. And this is likely due to changes in one of two things. Either the interaction between dynamics and CLEB, which I'll talk about later, but basically is responsible for condensation. These changes are causing more condensation in the model. Condensation is being more efficiently converted to precipitation by microphysics or both. So in order to understand what's going on from a more process-oriented perspective, we looked at what happens when you change the time steps associated with individual parameterization, the different physics schemes within the model. So many of these processes already in the model, they have implemented some degree of substepping or optional substepping. So we can change the time step associated with dynamics with CLEB, which does the turbulence, macrophysics, and shallow convection. It's sort of a unified scheme for those different things. And the Morrison-Gettleman microphysics, which is the stratiform microphysics scheme. Also, the coupling between these two parameterizations can be changed independently from CLEB and MG2 time steps themselves. We've also experimented with changes to deep convection time step. I'm not going to talk about that as much, partly because they're part of some code modifications, and it's not exactly apples to apples comparison. And also, for the most part, I don't think that the time step of deep convection by itself is really responsible for very many of these changes. So for each of these different pieces of the model, we changes the process time steps to 10 seconds, and we can split paired to the control run. These short runs were performed. These experiments were done in short runs that were around 30 days in length. That's again largely because of the constraints of the compute time we had available. So what we did was we largely, first of all, because the effect sizes were relatively large between the control and all 10, this wasn't enough time to really see difference there. Also, because all of these runs started from a shared initial condition, we were able to compare them mostly in the first 2 weeks of the simulation. And so there wasn't enough time for those simulations to completely diverge. And as a result, a lot more of the differences in that time period were due to these changes in the physics rather than these runs just sort of chaotically diverging from the initial condition. So I'm just going to briefly say what time steps in the model we changed that didn't really have an effect. The dynamics seemed to basically be resolved with the default time steps in the model, so that didn't have much effect. The club parameterization, which does most of the cloud physics, aside from the deep convection and the stratiform microphysics, that changed by itself, didn't really have much of an effect. And we also, as I mentioned earlier, we changed how often the radiative transfers we calculated. That didn't have too much of an effect. So it did have an effect. Well, so again, looking at what happened in the L10 run, just to summarize what it did to the global averages, we see this big increase in the large scale precipitation, which is, I left this slide from the version I gave to MWG, but basically Preckle is large scale. This is convective precipitation. And you see basically this almost canceling out of the changes. It's mostly just the large scale precipitation being stolen away from the deep convection scheme. Although there is a 0.05 millimeter per day increase in total precipitation as well. And so Club and MD2, which we've really changed the time steps of, are responsible for this part. And then there's a separate deep convection scheme that's responsible for the convective precipitation. So we already have this previous study talking about how more frequent coupling between deep convection and the other physics, not really the time step of the deep convection itself, but how often it's coupled to the large-scale condensation and to the dynamics. The more frequently you couple those, the more the large-scale condensation tends to outcompete the convection or take more of the available supersaturation produced by the dynamics away and cause that to condense, and it leaves left over for the deep convection. Whereas if you take very long time steps, due to the way that the process ordering works, the deep convection has more of a chance to use up more of that. So we know part of the reason for this already is just due to this, the particular details of how this model is constructed. On the other hand, we also, when we experiment with just changing the microphysics by itself, so we're not changing the coupling between the different physics schemes or any of these broad kind of model-wide things, just looking at changing the stratiform microphysics time step, you already see a significant shift in the precipitation towards the large-scale scheme, and you already see that the total is increasing about the same amount as when you substep everything, about 0.05 millimeters per day. So we did some prior research on the microphysical process rates specifically, and a lot of them are poorly resolved at time step sizes greater than a minute, which in the default configuration of ATSM, the microphysics is run at a 5-minute time step. And so the increased precipitation coming from the substep due to microphysics is consistent with the idea that these changes in precipitation we're seeing are partly due to increased precipitation efficiency from microphysics. There's also this single column experiment that was done last year. So this is actually from Shui Zheng at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And she found in single column study in ETSM that the rain evaporation is much more active at coarse time steps. And also the vertical distribution of rain mass is not very good. So in these graphs, you see the black line here is from the default time step, and the red is what happens if you reduce the time step. QR here is the rain mass, just taking for this single column. I think this is an average over first day or two of the experiment, and you see this weird double-lobed shape where there's a lot of rain in the cloud and then a lot of rain down here, and for some reason not a lot near the cloud base. And there's also a real much higher evaporation when you run at the default model time step. If you reduce that all the way to 30 seconds, most of the rain evaporation is actually occurring right when the rain leaves the cloud, which really seems to make more intuitive sense, and it matches the case study from the Magic Field campaign better, which is, I believe, where the single column case study came from. So what we see here is that this rain evaporation is much more active at coarse time steps. And what seems to have been done to get things to roughly balance in the global climate is to set the precipitation fraction to a too small value for it to compensate. So using this parameterization of how much area the precipitation is covering of the grid blocks, which is really supposed to be dealing with the horizontal resolution, and you're also modifying that to deal with this issue related to the time step. And so you can get the global averages in terms of precipitation rates to be roughly right that way. But when you look at the details and things like the vertical distribution of rain mass, it's not so good. So moving away from the microphysics specific things, we also looked at what happened when you change the time step of the club, which is responsible for the shallow convection of large scale condensation, and in G2, which is reducing the precipitation. If you change the time step of these two together, you get something that's much closer to the all 10 run. So this subsystem within E3SM is, perhaps not too surprisingly, responsible for a lot of the time step sensitivity of the precipitation. So it's not immediately clear why the repartitioning is happening here, although I'm going to get into a little bit later some of the mechanisms, or at least some aspect of why we think this happens. But it's not surprising that this would affect precipitation, and also not the microphysics by itself, but the combination to be what explains different extreme precipitation and different regional patterns of precipitation. So here is a little bit similar to the plot I showed before, but for these for 15-day runs is a much noisier plot. But basically what I have on the left is what happens if you take a model with mostly its default settings, so you change the pleb and do 2 time steps to 10 seconds. And on the right, what I have is you do the same thing, but you also allow pleb and MG2 to talk to each other. You have them coupled at that 10-second interval. The only difference between these two runs is have the same time step for those particular parameterizations. On the left, they're coupled every 5 minutes. On the right, they're coupled every 10 seconds. And there's no advantage to couple them less frequently. This is just to show the importance of that coupling. And in particular, you see that these increases in precipitation that happen over the land in the tropics really seem to show up only when you change that coupling frequency. So to get into this in a little bit more detail, I'm going to talk about a particular storm that
Sean?
that occurs in the Guiana Highlands in
Sean?
South America. Yeah?
Hi, sorry, I just have a quick question to basic.
Am I breaking up?
No. Well, you were a little bit, but this is not about that. Just about the basic question about the repartitioning from the large scale to the convective precipitation. So that I assume naively, right, that that's a very dependent on horizontal resolution. So if you look at higher resolutions, does that kind of effect go away, or?
Yeah, so so I did, for this study, I didn't do any changes to horizontal resolution, but in general, yes, you do see a reduction in the convective precipitation when you move to finer horizontal grids.
Okay, thanks.
To talk about a little bit why we get these concentrated heavy precipitation events and why they seem to be occurring specifically over land, we looked at basically the first column where you get this really heavy precipitation in South America when CLUB and MG2 are substepped together. And this seems to be in what's called in the literature, a grid point storm, which are basically these heavy storms that occur where at near the grid scale. So in this particular case, for most of its lifetime, this is occurring in about a 2x2 set of columns, so a relatively narrow area. So in the control simulation, which is shown here in black, and also the simulation where CLUB and MG2 are coupled at a 5-minute interval, which is in dark red, you'd really see relatively low precipitation, total precipitation occurring here compared with the other simulations. If you substep CLUB and MG2 together at a 10-second time step, that produces the purple here, which is much larger precipitation rate, and you also see this very large increase in 500 millibar vertical velocity. And if you substep everything, so including particularly the dynamics, together with and all of the physics parameterizations at 10 seconds, this precipitation rate more than doubles, and you see this huge vertical velocity, negative vertical velocity in this grid cell. And this is consistent with a type of storm that, like I said, has been called a grid point storm that's been studied before in CAM 3 and 4, that where you basically just have very large vertical velocity driven by a very large scale condensation rate. And so what happens is you get a lot of condensation, and then that produces a large vertical velocity, and that produces a lot of convergence. And the model seems to be very prone to doing that in these particular horizontal scales that are like just above where the grid scaling is. That happens for a variety of resolutions, as long as your resolution is fine enough. I think if you get above about a 2-degree grid spacing, you don't really see that happening anymore.
Hi, Sean, can I ask a quick question? Is this an area with topography or not so much?
Yeah, so that's why I pointed out that this is over South America. This is, I believe it's actually close to the leeward edge. Yeah, this is over Guiana Highlands, which is a somewhat mountainous area in Northeast South America. And these things, so these types of storms have been seen before, but they're often over ocean in previous models like CAM4. This is a usual case specific to this model where these are happening now largely or even exclusively actually over orography.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
So this is actually, I should have shown this when I was getting the, mentioning the mechanisms here before, but so on the left here I have, this is CLUB and MG2 coupled at a 5-minute interval. This is a 10-second interval, and this is the whole model running at a 10-second interval. So what I'm comparing here are, on the top you have the condensation rate, In the middle, you have vertical velocity, and on the bottom, you have grain production. These are all over time, the horizontal and altitude vertically. And so you basically see that these things all are increasing in lockstep and that they're significantly higher. There's this much more well-defined cell developing in the when you change the MG2 and club coupling, and then that intensifies and also seems to really deepen when you change the you also are coupling goes with the dynamics at the second interval. So there's two views on that I've seen on why this may be happening, specifically when you change the pi. So the sort of commonly accepted explanation, which would be true for CAM4, is that these grid point storms occur because the convection is too weak, and a small coupling Timestep tends to weaken these schemes by allowing the convection schemes to consume less of the instability, and instead releasing a lot more of the energy of the system by through just condensation in the large scale condensation. So figure A here is showing a change that changes the vertical velocity by quite a bit, which is basically just changes a relaxation timescale in the convective scheme. So with the red line is basically boosting the convection scheme by a lot, and you see that the negative vertical velocities that occur in CAM4 really start to go away. So from that reading, this is basically an issue with the parameterized convection not really relieving instability, and so it ends up having to be absorbed by the dynamics, which is producing these large, intense storms at around the grid cell. Another way of thinking about this, which is not related to the convection parameterizations at all, comes from this study from Harrington and Reed a couple of years ago. They're interested in resolved convection that can occur even in hydrostatic models to some extent. And so you get these updrafts that are still occurring, even if they're much weaker in hydrostatic models with coarse grids. And of course, the condensation rate has a big effect on how strong those updrafts are. And so they found that even if you have no convective parameterization, just affecting how the dynamics and the large-scale condensation scheme are coupled directly affects the updraft speed. And so under this picture, what's happening is basically that it's not that the parameterized convection is becoming too weak, but rather the resolved convection that's occurring is basically too strong. That the condensation dynamics coupling is just much more intense, and so when you get this, or much more tight, I should say, and so when you get these vicious cycles where the condensation and the dynamics are feeding into each other to produce these storms at the grid scale level, that's due to using a smaller time step that's just resolving the convection that the model sort of wants to do already. And so that's an alternate explanation. And they've also done this study at a variety of horizontal resolutions. So this graph is from one of their papers, and they find that, so this is horizontal resolution basically on the x-axis. This is maximum vertical velocity for their idealized test on the vertical axis. And so as you reduce the grid spacing, then these updrafts become smaller or horizontally and much more are able to produce much higher vertical velocity. And when you use a shorter time step for the dynamics physics coupling, you can resolve this quite well, as the speed of the updrafts can become much higher. But if you use a lower time step, then basically at all resolutions, you have sort of a suppression of this resolved convection. And it's much less dependent on the size of the horizontal grid. So which is the better way to think about this?
Sean, can I ask a quick question about the last thing? Is that large scale? Should we think of the x-axis on the right, sorry, the y-axis as large scale vertical motion, or updraft speed, or parameterized updraft speed, you know, and with maybe a number of updrafts in one grid box? Thanks.
Yeah, so this is an idealized test that they did where they actually had no parameterized convection. So this is just the mean for the whole grid box. And so that's why it can become so much larger when the grid scale is reduced, because then you're actually able to resolve. So that's also an explanation for why these storms seem to be consistently happening at a few grid cells in width. That what it's actually trying to do, I mean, it's a sort of a loose anthropomorphic way of putting it, but it's attempting to produce convection that's, actually would be occurring at much smaller scales than it can actually resolve. And so the best that the model can do is produce at basically the limit of its resolution. And so it produces these weak, I shouldn't say weak, I should say just, it does whatever it can at near the truncation scale for the grid. So this is an idealized test without parameterized convection. And so this is just, they actually just release basically a bubble. This is a rising bubble test. And they just look at the maximum speed of that bubble as it rises. And that's sort of their toy model for looking at these kinds of updrafts without the complication of the full physics.
Okay, thank you.
So we have these two, I said sort of which is right here, but I guess I think these two views are both right, that both the strength of the resolved convection scheme matters, of the parameterized, the deep convection that's parameterized matters, and the strength of this sort of resolved convection both matter, but this question of which is more relevant to the time step sensitivity here is if the result of the deep convection scheme being too weak and not suppressing, or is it because you get tighter dynamic condensation coupling, and so even if the deep convection scheme is still pretty strong, it would still be able to break through that and produce these kinds of grid cell storms. So one thing that we noticed is that actually reducing the deep convection time scale, the simplest way of just boosting the deep convection scheme, doesn't really seem to inhibit these storms in the way that it does for CAM4 in the E3SM atmosphere model. We also see that the deep convection scheme is seeing pretty low values of convectively available potential energy when these storms are growing. So it's not actually being given much instability to work with. And so that sort of suggests that even if you boost this scheme, it's not really going to help, because the way that these are being coupled is really relieving the instability too readily by just sort of lifting the entire column. So this needs to be looked into further. This is sort of where we were when I graduated. So this has sort of been put on pause for a moment, looking into what's going on here. But regardless of the answer here specifically, we probably want to prevent this resolved convection, which is never going to be realistic at these grid scales. At least it shouldn't be so prevalent that it's causing a huge proportion of the precipitation that's falling in the model and really changing regional patterns of precipitation. And so that suggests that if we want to be able to use this model at short time steps, and based on what we've seen so far, this takes a lot more tuning to deal with, even if you go to shorter, smaller resolutions. We should really be thinking about just rethinking the way that the parameterization of deep convection is done to find another way to, or a better way to release this instability without without causing these grid point storms. So I talked a bunch about the dynamics physics coupling just now. The other question we have is, why does the club MG2 coupling matter? Because way back at the beginning, that's what I was trying to figure out by looking at these, this particular case study. And the answer is sort of, we don't know. But to give us less of a cop-out answer, there's a lot of possibilities, but we need to do some investigation, or we need to maybe rope somebody who knows club better to do more investigation into why this is happening. So we could see that somehow the more frequent club at MG2 is giving club the idea that the state in the grid cell is more uniform. And so maybe because club is doing some degree of shallow convection, also, if it's doing less of that, maybe it's trying to produce cloud in the whole grid box at once more often. And so maybe that's changing condensation rate that way, or the reverse. We also don't really understand, particularly because club has this very complex view of subgrid scale variability of the water and of the correlation between water content and vertical velocity, for instance, within a grid cell. And we don't really understand how that interacts with MG2, which has a much cruder view of just saying, well, in the grid box average, we're turning this much cloud water into rain. And it has no real prediction for where that's coming from, if it's coming from the densest cloud only or uniformly across the cloud. So something to do with that may have something to do with it, with why this weird time step sensitivity is happening. I already mentioned shallow convection. So I've talked about a lot of different things here. This is sort of an uncommon time step study. So there's there are a lot of different trivia that have come out of this study, but sort of to wrap up what we've found in terms of time step sensitivity for the Ethereum atmosphere model. First of all, it has big problems with time step sensitivity. And this does affect people who want to do things like run regionally refined models, for instance, where they have to change the time step or either have to run the entire model at the same time step, even though the horizontal grid is different, or they have to try to find a way to change the time step for different parts of the globe. And if the physics is very dependent on the time step, this is a big problem. It's also just introduces more headaches for tuning because you have to tune the model for different resolutions whenever changes are made. This has raised this question that's really kind of an old persistent question for a lot of models, which is how do you parameterize convection in a consistent way that works at different time and spatial resolutions? There's a sort of a lot of questions now, of course, about when you're actually making non-hydrostatic models with very fine grids and you're actually resolving convection, how do you deal with that? But there's also, even before you get down to that scale, you already have the sensitivity of the convection schemes and the interaction of the convection schemes with the rest of the model that really is dependent on the time and horizontal scales. We also noticed that using forward Euler integration for microphysics process rates just doesn't resolve them well. And we found that it's around sub-minute time steps that you need to resolve things like the rain production and evaporation rate. And we don't want to do that because that's expensive, and we certainly can't run the whole model affordably at those time steps, but even the microphysics by itself. And so we really want to look at some kind of different strategy for dealing with this that makes some microphysics less sensitive to the particular time step size. And then we have this sort of mystery that needs some more work, which is why does reducing the coupling time step between CLEB and MG2 lead to these intense high precipitation storms? The fact that the orography correlates so well with whether these storms occur seems to suggest that that's part of the mechanism, but we don't really get what specifically about this coupling is affected by that. So until we understand that, it's not really clear if this is something where we should just tune away by using different parameters at different time or horizontal resolutions, or if this is some more serious conceptual issue. Because sometimes when you see these high degrees of sensitivity to resolution, it's because there's some assumption in the model that's only valid at certain scales, or it's only valid, say, a certain fraction of the time, and the exceptions become more important at different length or temporal scales. So that's sort of my summary of what's going on with time step size and precipitation in E3SM. I'd just like to thank people who are involved in this whole project, including funding from the Department of Energy and the people at Lawrence Livermore National Lab who I worked with. And I do have something of a bibliography here that includes the main papers that I cited. So that, if there are other questions, I'm available. And I have a lot of slides that were cut from this because I've given several versions of this talk. So if there's anything specifically you'd like me to talk about, I can probably find some.
Great, thank you very much, John. Okay, somebody's going to ask a question.
Yeah, this is Andy. I have a comment and a question. The first is that we have this Morrison Gentleman 2 microphysics here, and long story short, we substep the as you probably know, the scheme works by all these microphysics processes, kind of rain production, and all the rates are done, and then sedimentation it's really decoupled. Then the sedimentation is all done, and then you have a few instantaneous adjustments after precipitation. But so it might go a long way toward reducing this sort of pathological behavior if you include the evaporation of rain and sublimation and deposition of snow during the sedimentation. We've done that, and I've not looked at these time step dependencies. I don't even know if we have subgrid scale single cell storms, but at any rate, just an idea. I know you're not there anymore, so it's kind of late. But if you are talking to Hugh or someone, it seems like a fairly obvious thing to reduce it's kind of conceptual problem.
Yeah, well, part of the way that we're doing the BOSS microphysics is really, rather than trying to develop the stream from scratch, we're looking at implementing it by basically replacing parts of MG2. So some of these issues are going to be still relevant, and I'm still working with you quite a lot. So,
okay,
yeah,
well,
it's something to look at. I do want to point out that is part of the issue that was seen in this case study here.
That's what made me think of it.
Yeah, so there's the evaporation sedimentation interaction, and then there's also, I think for the very long time steps specifically, there seems to be this weird, almost like a resonance or something, where it's you just get this issue at the cloud base, and that corresponds to a large fall speed, and as a result, you get this kind of convergence where the rain, this sort of seems to form stably, where the rain moves very quickly through this layer, and then it all gets stuck where the fall speed is low down here. And so part of the issue is not just that the evaporation isn't following the rain as it falls because the sedimentation and the evaporation did separately, but also because the fall speed is only calculated at the beginning before the sedimentation loop. When you get a big mass of rain falling, it changes speed as it falls, and it can actually slow down because it falls into a region where the rain speed is slower. so that's also an issue that the fall speed should actually be updated inside the sedimentation loop. At least
That
in the
is a
original
good.
version of MG2, that wasn't done.
Yeah, that is. I mean, there's an even worse pathology in MG2 is like it doesn't fill in precipitation fall speeds below where there's precipitation on entry to the subroutine, right? And so it's like precip can only go pretty much one layer, and so
Yeah.
we got around that. We just took whatever the precip rate was at the lowest level and just extended it downwards. To avoid that problem,
Yeah.
which made a big difference for stratocumulus. I don't know if it didn't really look at decompression. At any rate, yes, there's a lot there's a lot to be done in that sedimentation and evaporation logic, without a doubt. The other question is, well, then my question is the stratiforms, whatever you call it, club. Does all that stuff come before deep convection in a time step?
No, it comes after deep convection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. All right,
So,
thanks.
Yeah, although the
interesting.
process ordering matters less when the time step's smaller. So
we also do convection gets first cut at instability.
yeah, I think most models that I know do, but
yep. Yeah. Thanks. Good stuff.
Yep. Thanks.
Any more questions? I guess I just have one more question on the figure that Anne referenced before. It was x-axis was radius, and you were looking at, I think, the minimum vertical velocity. Do you mind just bringing that back? Right, yeah, that one.
Oh, is it this one?
Exactly, yeah. So this is not my field or anything, but so the kind of the lack of convergence and, if anything, divergence in the minimum vertical velocity at the lowest or the shortest horizontal scales. Presumably the gray lines represent some kind of theoretical prediction. Do you understand, knowing this paper, why the mismatch between the theory and what these numerical experiments are showing at these scales?
Yeah, so the theory is predicting a 1 over x delta x, 1 over the grid spacing dependence. Of course, what should eventually stop that from just diverging as the grid spacing goes down is eventually you start to get actual dissipation of the updraft from one mechanism or the other, but we're just not in a regime where that's happening yet. As far as why these are so far off, this is, so the red circles are using the short dynamics physics coupling step, and so it's fine there. But when you use a longer time step, the vertical velocity, and I talked to Adam Harrington a bit about this recently, about giving a more thorough explanation for why this depends so much on time step. But it seems to really be that you just can't get, it's sort of a speed gap. You just can't get higher than a certain vertical velocity in the time that this experiment occurs over. And that's, I believe, largely because we're talking about this vicious cycle that which in this case is sort of correct. Don't think I shouldn't call it vicious, but it's the condensation and the dynamics are feeding off of each other. And so the higher condensation rate causes, over time, causes more convergence that's feeding in more water vapor. And that kind of positive feedback is just always underestimated when you have a sequential split in your model. So if you're alternating these two processes back and forth, the direction of the error is always systematically going to be to underestimate that. And so especially when you've got this explosive growth, underestimating at first, because it's sort of an exponential increase over time, or usually at least like a more than linear increase over time, underestimating at first just keeps you farther and farther behind. And so over time, the error piles up. And so that's sort of my vague, very hand-wavy explanation for why that matters so much. You're just not resolving that coupling fast enough to resolve how quickly that vertical velocity is growing.
No, thanks. That actually does help clarify it quite a bit. Thanks.
I have one more question if there's time, Clara.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So Sean, the problem that you and Andy were just discussing about, say, substepping precipitation and stratocumulus, those things are quite amenable to studying with an SCM. But, something we noticed recently with our change of dynamical core is that, or at least we know about this in our old dynamical core, is that we see some pretty strange omega profiles where we have sharp topography or, highly variable topography. And so that is not very amenable, I guess, to studying with an SCM. So I wonder if you, if these problems that you're talking about with this South American case study, are they dependent on your dynamical core?
Yeah, so there, E3SM specifically really only has one supported dynamical core, which makes it a little bit harder. So this particular study here has actually been done with different dynamical cores in CSM. So for example, this still occurs with a finite volume, even though the vertical velocity, I think, is very different in that case. You see basically the same picture, it's just scaled. I guess my short answer is that I think some of these effects do happen for different dynamical cores, but I haven't tested.
Thanks.
Any more questions? Great. Well, thanks so much, Sean. This is really interesting work. I'll just remind everyone that we recorded this presentation and it will be uploaded probably within about a week. I want to thank everyone for coming and thanks again, Sean, for giving a really nice seminar.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Clara. Ciao.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.